Okay, welcome back to FIA's Experts Discussion Series. So with me today, Reza. And so we have our guest today, so Professor Harald Full. So welcome back to FIA. I think your last visit was back to 2019, and we are really glad to have you
pandemic,
here
yes.
again. Yes. So today we will have a short discussions about the issue of necessary and sufficient conditions for institutionalizing low carbon development in developing countries, especially within the context of Indonesia. So Indonesian government also has announced their commitment since October 2017 to also incorporate the low carbon development issues into the country's development agenda coordinated by Bappenas. So today, we will have a talk with the expert, Professor Harald Fuhr. We have been collaborating in research projects, so they locate the institutionalizations of low carbon development between University of Indonesia, University of Potsdam, and also Technical University of Darmstadt, Germany. So about this issue, for the first questions, so could you please elaborate what exactly low carbon development?
Thank you, Reza. The question of low carbon development has to do something with our development pattern of the last decades, actually our time ever since the industrialization in the 19th century. Actually, our whole economic system and our societal development is based on using fossil fuels as an energy, as a major energy source. And that's why we have actually enjoyed high carbon development, enjoyed in inverted commas, during the last decades. Half of the emissions in the atmosphere right now, the accumulated emissions, stem from the time 1990 to today. So all the emissions ever since 1850, half of them were generated after 1990. That means the last 30 years have been very successful in terms of poverty alleviation, economic development, industrialization, and social development, but they have had a price for the environment, for the atmosphere, in terms of the emission generated from fossil fuel-based energy. And low carbon development means we need to stop using carbon as an energy source because we need to decarbonize our economy to make sure we're not generating any more emissions in the atmosphere. The emissions in the atmosphere lead to global warming, to a greenhouse effect. We have already exceeded the 1 degree Celsius mark already, according to the Paris Protocol, United Nations Paris Protocol and agreement in 2018. We're supposed to stop global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial era in the 19th century. And we already reached 1 degree, sorry. So there's an urgent need to stop global warming by not using fossil fuels anymore and decarbonize the economy. But as I said briefly, this is a gigantic, massive enterprise and challenge. But it has also a variety of important co-benefits. So we shouldn't be afraid of moving from high carbon development to low carbon development, because doing it would require decarbonizing our economy, but it would also have a lot of co-benefits like clean air, protecting the environment, reforestation, changing agriculture, changing our transport systems. All of these measures and all of these innovations would have co-benefits for the society as well, basically through a better environment and a better planet in which we're living.
I see. So, in general, so from your talk earlier, so it was there was a trade-off also between economic development and its impact, so emissions, so the impacts also to the environment. Do you think it is makes sense also for those who are generating money and revenue, and then would like us to shifting into a better awareness on environment, and perhaps so they have loss in the terms of revenue, and how to deal with this?
Well, we need to understand that this global warming doesn't only heat up the planet, it has consequences in the atmosphere and leads to extreme weather events and sea level rise. You have 17,000 islands, some of them will disappear, most likely. And you had several incidences around the world now of catastrophes and problems that were generated, obviously, by a changing climate. So extreme weather events, floods, droughts, etc., have severe consequences and high costs, impose high costs on the population. So moving out of this problem, I think, is already a major benefit. So I think there's urgent need for action, and it has its cost, but it has a lot of co-benefits, as I mentioned before. And doing it would require changing the course of action, moving out of fossil fuels, and developing, for example, renewable energy sources that you have plenty of in Indonesia, such as solar power and wind, geothermal. So calculations and research shows that there's plenty of renewable energy around the world, that we don't need to rely on fossil fuels.
Okay. So I would argue that it's also really highly dependent on the leadership, right? So the commitment of the leadership of Indonesia. And then, as we know, every single 5 years or so, there will be a new president elected, and so on and so on. And then, do you think we need to institutionalize it, and how to make sure there's a sustained commitment from Indonesian governments to this low carbon development?
That's an excellent example, Reza. We need to get away from climate experiments, little innovations here and there, they come and go. We need to really fix decarbonization, either legally, through new laws, rules and regulations that are permanent. You don't want one government doing this and another government doing that. But you want to fix low carbon development and the pattern that I mentioned before, moving out of fossil fuels. Not only for one government, you want to have this permanently, because that's the need for your society. And there's a second mechanism, which would be using markets. For example, by using carbon taxes. You put the price of the damage that is caused by fossil fuels use and burning back into the price of fossil fuels. Now we have an artificially low price of carbon products, of fossil fuels, which do not include the damage they create by using or burning them. So putting it back into the price system would make other sources of energy competitive and cheaper, actually. So much of the problem are distortions in market prices that would need to be removed. So by using markets more effectively, we also would institutionalize low carbon development.
I see.
And we need to make sure that this all takes place in an environment where you have citizen participation, because in short term you will have winners and losers. And you need to make sure you compensate the losers short term, which may be the poorer population in your society. So you need institutions also for balancing change and making sure no one is left behind.
So talking a bit further about the use of fossil fuels in Indonesia, this is a major issue happening in public discussion, especially in big cities such as Jakarta, because the governments of Indonesia still allocating a significant amount of subsidy for the use of fossil fuels, right? I mean, talking about how to institutionalize it, I mean, do you think, from your point of view, should we start from big cities as to become role model for other small cities in Indonesia? And then how should the central government and regional governments support this initiative?
That's another important issue in climate change, that you realize that sometimes cities are much more active than the national government. We have a kind of a network of C40 cities around the world. It's called C40. It's a network of climate policy committed cities around the world, and they are very active. Sao Paulo, Rio, Berlin, Heidelberg, lots of cities in Scandinavia, but as far as I know, Jakarta is also a member. And of course, these cities have less complex decision-making than a national government. Mm-hmm. They cannot, of course, move out of subsidies. The cities can't do that. That's something that the national government usually does. Mm-hmm. But cities can experiment with a lot of new ideas, maybe bicycle roads, urban transport, electrification of mass transportation, building codes for houses. No, all of these things are usually happening in cities, and they can be done without the national government. But there are things that the national government needs to do, for example, fiscal policies, carbon taxes, etc., and moving out of subsidies. So the problem indeed is we're subsidizing the use of fossil fuels instead of disincentivizing the use of fossil fuels. We need to move out of subsidizing fossil fuels constantly and make other sources of energy more competitive. So if you move out of the subsidy element, already new renewable energy will be much cheaper, solar, wind, and geothermal, and that's the way to go. So moving out of subsidies is also good for fiscal aspects.
Yeah. But in the case of Indonesia, in my point of view as Indonesian, so it may harm the popularity of the politicians,
yes.
right? So for running for the elections.
Yeah.
And then I would like us to elaborate further about the C40 members. So are there any differences from member countries that belongs to developed countries, and so let's say in comparison to the members of countries that belong also under the developing countries?
I'm not sure about the numbers, but I would assume that at least half of them are cities in the developing world, such as I said before, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, I think Buenos Aires. So all the major cities around the world, and the majority is in the developing world, are members of C40 and committed to climate action. And they learn from each other, they meet, irrespective of what their national governments are doing. So this is quite interesting. But you're right, we need to think about compensating potential short-term losers. For example, just moving out of fossil fuel subsidies would increase the price for fossil fuel, for gasoline, for example, which would immediately have an effect for bus prices and for urban transportation. And you need to either work with voucher system or you need to work with subsidizing transport, but in a targeted manner. The problem with subsidies is usually you don't target the poor. You want to help the poor, but you're actually helping the middle class and the higher classes through cheap gasoline. So the targeting of these subsidies usually leaves much to desire. So you need to think about new mechanisms of compensating people that suffer from higher prices of fossil fuels, short term at least, but at one point in time they will also benefit from cheaper energy through solar power or wind power, which they can install on their roofs, for example.
So because this also need a huge of investments, right? I mean, according to the recent research on the total average of investment as required to support Indonesian low carbon development policy, it is estimated Indonesia needs around almost 450 billion US dollars. Which is quite huge also to cover the program's activities between 2020 to 2024. So if you are trying also to have a lesson also from success stories, perhaps as I assume from developed countries, who or what also will become also the sources of investment in this regard, also to support the LCDI policy?
I think many people think that this is a government task. It is partly a government task when it comes to rules and regulations on the framework in which you work. And the government will still need to subsidize in a very targeted manner the move to low carbon development. But the huge amount, the vast amount of investment will probably need to come from the private sector. Think about the expansion of your mobile phones in the 1990s and 2000s. They were not based on government investment. This was all done by private companies, by the telephone companies. So, and for low carbon development and decarbonization, you would need to think about a similar mechanism. If the prices are right, there will be investors. because they anticipate all the products that are existing now need to go. And we need new types of products, new types of energy, new types of investment, green investment. If this is the future, investors will do it. And the message is quite clearly, you need to cooperate between public and private much more intensively, and you need to mobilize private sector development and private sources of investment. Otherwise, you cannot accumulate those amounts needed. The German coal transition costs 50 billion, which is pure public money, moving out of our coal sectors and closing the coal-fire plants, coal power plants. Cost about 55 billion euros until 2035. This is pure public money. But for all the remaining investment in renewable energy around the world, you will need the private sector and private sources of investment. And you fix your own house by putting solar panels. That's your own expenditure. Right? So you want this private initiative as well, and it will be much higher than what the government does in the future.
So in other words, so we really need to convince and to make all of the key stakeholders think this is beneficial for the futures.
That's why you need to institutionalize. You need to fix it to make it credible. It needs to be a credible framework that everyone knows that's the way we go. And then once there's confidence in the society and commitment, the markets will ensure that there is investment. And it will not be lost investment because they are changing course again.
As an educational institution, we also have the role also to disseminate and to promote also this low carbon development, what benefits and so on, right? Okay, so I think that's also for today. Thanks very much, Professor Haralfur. We will be back also with a more interesting discussion on how the Indonesian younger generations get benefited also from the low carbon development Indonesian context. Thank you very much and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.